Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe and leave a like. It means everything to us. Please share this video with someone you care about and switch on post notifications so you won't miss any future videos. Thank you for always supporting. Now, relax and let's begin. Elizabeth Cole sat beside her father's hospital bed, her fingers wrapped around his weakening hand as the evening rain tapped softly against the window. The room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Her father, once a proud school principal with a commanding voice, now bred like every breath had to fight its way out of him. Elizabeth forced a smile through her tears. "Daddy, please stop talking like this. You will come home," she whispered. But he only looked at her with that painful tenderness fathers wear when they know time is slipping. On the plastic chair beside her, Tiffany cried quietly, wiping her nose with trembling hands. The door opened gently, and Tony Van stepped in, tall, composed, and dressed in a dark suit that still carried the dust of a rushed evening. Elizabeth's father tried to sit up. "Tony," he murmured. Tony moved closer at once. The older man gripped his wrists weakly. "Please, don't let my daughters be swallowed after I'm gone," his voice cracked. Elizabeth turned away, unable to bear it. Tony lowered his head, his expression tightening with emotion. "Sir, I give you my word," he said quietly. Her father exhaled with relief, as though that promise carried more medicine than anything in the room ever had. The days after the burial felt colder than grief itself. Elizabeth moved through the house like someone wandering inside a dream she could not wake from. Condolence visitors had thinned, but tension had replaced them. Voices dropped whenever she entered the sitting room. Her father's files, documents, and little savings suddenly mattered to people who had barely visited him when he was alive. Tanya Cole, her cousin, leaned against the doorway one afternoon and said, "This world is not kind to fatherless girls, Elizabeth. You better wake up fast." The remark sounded like advice, but its smile was full of poison. Tiffany, overhearing it, stormed away in angry tears. At night, Elizabeth heard whispers from the dining area where distant uncles discussed the house as if she and Tiffany were temporary guests in their own lives. She clutched her father's framed photograph and cried into her pillow. Tony came by the next day with his lawyer and politely requested all disputed documents be brought forward for proper review. He did not raise his voice, but the room changed when he spoke. Elizabeth watched him from the corridor, surprised by how safe his presence made her feel. For the first time since the funeral, someone stood in the middle of the gathering and made selfish people fall silent. Tony moved swiftly once he saw how ugly things were becoming. He arranged temporary accommodation in one of his family's older guest apartments and made sure Elizabeth and Tiffany were relocated before more relatives could corner them emotionally. He instructed his legal team to secure her father's papers, and for the first time in weeks, Elizabeth slept without hearing arguments through the walls. Yet, peace did not come with safety. Gossip bloomed immediately. Tanya arrived uninvited, looked around the clean apartment, and said with a laugh, "So, this is how it starts? A rich man saves the helpless girl, and everybody pretends it is just kindness." Elizabeth's face burned with shame. Tony heard enough of the gossip from others to understand what it could become. One evening, he asked Elizabeth to meet him on the balcony overlooking the city. The sky was bruised with sunset, and her heart beat with strange unease. He spoke slowly. "This arrangement is protecting you, but not enough. People are already speaking carelessly. I can shield you in many ways, Elizabeth, but not from every mouth." She looked up at him. "What are you saying?" Tony paused, then said, "Marry me." The words dropped between them like something both heavy and impossible. Elizabeth stared, not knowing whether to feel rescued, trapped, or deeply seen. Elizabeth did not answer Tony immediately. For 2 nights, she hardly slept. She sat on the small bed in the guest apartment while Tiffany watched her with worried eyes. "Do you want this?" Tiffany asked softly. Elizabeth's voice shook. "I don't know. I only know he is a good man." She was not foolish. She understood that love had not brought the proposal. Duty had, protection had, perhaps pity too. Still, in the middle of all her fear, she knew Tony had never once looked at her with the greed or opportunism she now saw in other people. That mattered more than she wanted to admit. When Elizabeth finally gave Tony her answer, she did so quietly. "Yes," she said, holding her hands together to stop them from trembling. Tony looked relieved, but not joyful, and that small detail settled inside her chest like a stone. He thanked her with grave respect, as though they were signing a treaty instead of beginning a life. Later that night, Tony sat alone in his study and stared at the acceptance message on his phone. He told himself he was doing the honorable thing. He would give her security, dignity, peace, and time. He would never touch what grief had not yet freely laid in his hands. Their wedding was elegant but restrained, attended by a small circle of family, friends, business associates, and the few people who genuinely cared for Elizabeth. She looked breathtaking in a simple gown that did not try too hard. Tiffany cried openly through most of the ceremony, smiling and sobbing at once. Tanya arrived overdressed and watched everything with a tight mouth and restless eyes. "Some girls are just lucky," she muttered to another cousin, making sure Elizabeth overheard. Tony stood tall at the altar, calm and serious, his voice steady as he made his vows. Elizabeth answered him clearly, though her heart beat with gratitude and unspoken uncertainty. That night, the room prepared for them was soft, with candlelight and fresh flowers. Elizabeth sat at the edge of the bed, nervous and silent, her wedding bangles cool against her skin. Tony entered after changing, saw the tension in her shoulders, and his expression softened. He poured her water, handed her the glass, and sat a careful distance away. "You do not have to be afraid," he said gently. "Rest tonight. There is no pressure here." Elizabeth blinked in surprise. She nodded, murmuring, "Thank you." Relief washed through her first, then confusion followed quietly behind it. A marriage had begun, yet something essential remained unopened. Elizabeth entered Tony's world slowly, as though she feared making noise inside it. His mansion was beautiful, tastefully decorated, and large enough to make footsteps sound lonely. The staff treated her with immediate respect, calling her Madame with polished warmth. Tony ensured she lacked nothing. Her room was filled with books he thought she would like. Fresh flowers appeared every few days, and her preferences were quietly remembered before she spoke them twice. Still, she often stood by the tall bedroom windows and felt strangely misplaced. Everything around her said wife, comfort, and honor. Yet inside, she felt more like a carefully protected guest. Tony remained consistently kind. He asked how her day had gone, remembered Tiffany's school concerns, and shielded Elizabeth from every practical inconvenience. When she looked tired, he noticed. When she skipped meals, he asked the cook to make lighter dishes, but his emotional door remained half closed. He never brushed her hand accidentally, never let his voice soften into vulnerability, never crossed the invisible line between attentiveness and intimacy. Elizabeth tried to tell herself it was patience. Perhaps he was simply giving her time. Yet every night when she lay alone in the vast bed, a question rose and refused to sleep. Would patience ever become closeness? Months passed, and Tony continued being the kind of husband people praised loudly. He never embarrassed Elizabeth in public, never stayed out recklessly, never surrounded himself with women, and never made her feel financially dependent in a humiliating way. He included her in dinners, introduced her with pride, and treated her father's memory with respect. To outsiders, their marriage looked mature and enviable. Elizabeth learned how to smile on cue. She learned how to rest her hand on Tony's arm at events and how to answer questions with grace when people asked when they would begin having children. The performance became easier than the truth. But private nights became more difficult. Elizabeth would often hear Tony's footsteps pause outside their room before moving on toward his study. Sometimes he stayed in the room, reading late into the night from the armchair instead of lying beside her. She never asked why. Her upbringing had taught her dignity, restraint, and silence around pain. Still, tears came often after the lights were off. "What is wrong with me?" she whispered once into the darkness. Ashamed of the question, even as she asked it, she had not been beaten, insulted, or abandoned. Yet somehow, she felt rejected in the gentlest way possible. Tanya began visiting more frequently once she realized Elizabeth would not send her away easily. She brought fruits, gossip, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She studied the mansion, the expensive furnishings, the polished piece, and quickly sensed the hollow places hidden beneath it. One afternoon, while Tony was away, Tanya lounged in the sitting room and said, "You know, men like Tony don't marry girls like us for romance. They marry for image, convenience, obedience." Elizabeth stiffened. "Please don't speak about my husband like that." Tanya shrugged. "Then tell me why a newly married woman still looks like she sleeps alone." Elizabeth tried to dismiss the conversation, but Tanya's words followed her into the evening like smoke clinging to fabric. That night, when Tony returned and asked if she had eaten, she answered politely and kept her eyes lowered. He sensed a shift but misread it as fatigue. Later, standing before the mirror, Elizabeth touched her own face and searched for what might be lacking. She hated herself for listening to Tanya. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a small voice had already been asking similar questions in softer language. Was she truly a wife, or simply a responsibility dressed in silk and introduced with courtesy? Inside Tony, a war had been unfolding from the start. He had expected the marriage to remain practical, respectful, and clear. Instead, Elizabeth's quiet ways unsettled him. The way she thanked house staff by name, the way she still set aside his tea exactly how he liked it without being asked, the way her sadness never turned bitter, those things reached him more than dramatic beauty ever could. He found himself looking for her when he entered rooms. He noticed how the house felt different when she laughed, however rarely. Love crept in quietly, and because it came without permission, it frightened him more than it pleased him. Tony kept telling himself that Elizabeth had entered the marriage from grief, instability, and dependence. If he claimed her too soon, he might become the kind of powerful man who mistakes gratitude for consent. That thought disgusted him. So, every time desire rose in him, he buried it under duty. Every time he noticed her softness toward him, he suspected circumstance might be speaking louder than choice. He chose restraint again and again, not seeing that his silence had begun causing the very harm he hoped to avoid. In trying not to take advantage of her vulnerable heart, he was slowly teaching her that her heart was unwanted. For their first anniversary, Tony planned everything himself. He took Elizabeth to a quiet restaurant overlooking the ocean, away from cameras, acquaintances, and social obligations. The table was decorated with white flowers, and a violinist played softly nearby. Elizabeth wore a pale blue dress that made Tony stare a second too long before looking away. He gave her a small velvet box, and inside was not jewelry, but a key. To the reading studio, he explained. "Your father once told me you dreamed of having a space of your own, filled with books." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "You remember that?" she whispered. Tony only nodded. For one evening, hope came back to life inside her. They laughed more easily. Their conversation wandered into childhood memories, favorite books, and the parts of grief that never truly leave. Elizabeth thought, maybe tonight, something will finally change. Maybe all this waiting has been leading somewhere gentle and beautiful. But when they returned home, Tony kissed her forehead with painful tenderness and said, "You should rest. It has been a long day." Elizabeth smiled because she had learned how to survive with smiles. Only after the door closed did she collapse on the bed and cry with both hands pressed over her mouth. At one of Tony's corporate events, Elizabeth accompanied him in a dark green gown that made even seasoned socialites turn and look. She spoke gracefully to people from different backgrounds, listened well, and carried herself with a calm dignity that surprised many in Tony's circle. Chester Hale, one of Tony's polished business associates, was drawn to her almost immediately. He was charming without being vulgar, attentive without crossing the line. During dinner, he asked Elizabeth about literature, family, and architecture, and she answered with quiet intelligence. Tony watched from nearby, saying little, but something sharp and unfamiliar began rising inside him. With each warm smile Chester earned. Later in the evening, Chester said lightly, "Mrs. Vaughn, your husband hides you too well. He should bring you out more often." Elizabeth smiled politely. "I am not hidden, Mr. Hale." Chester held her gaze a second too long. Some things are visible and still neglected. The words were subtle, but Tony heard them. His jaw tightened. Elizabeth immediately stepped back into formality, but the damage had been done. On the drive home, Tony barely spoke. For the first time, jealousy sat in his chest like heat. Another man had noticed her sadness. Another man had seen the softness Tony himself had refused to reach for. Raul Mendez had known Tony long enough to read silence better than speech. When they met for lunch a few days after the event, Raul watched him stir untouched coffee and finally said, "You look like you wanted to drag Chester out by his collar that night." Tony gave him a flat look. "Do not start." Raul leaned back. "Then let me ask the better question. Why are you jealous of attention you have refused to earn?" Tony's expression hardened. He began explaining the same reasoning he had repeated to himself for months. Elizabeth's grief, her vulnerability, his promise, his caution. Raul listened without interruption, then shook his head slowly. "You call it honor," Raul said, "but it is starting to look like fear dressed in good manners." Tony frowned. "That is unfair." Raul did not soften. "No, what is unfair is leaving a woman confused for over a year while congratulating yourself for restraint." Tony looked away, the accusation landing harder because it contained truth. Raul lowered his voice. "A woman can be housed, fed, protected, and still be emotionally starving. Are you protecting Elizabeth or protecting yourself from needing her too much?" Tony said nothing. His silence answered more honestly than his pride ever could. After that evening with Chester, Elizabeth changed in small ways Tony failed to understand. She stopped dressing with hidden expectation. She no longer stood by the balcony, waiting to hear his car before sunset. She still fulfilled every role with grace, but she began folding her hope inward, as though protecting it from further bruising. When Tony complimented a dress, she thanked him politely instead of glowing. When he asked how her day had gone, she answered clearly but briefly. She was not punishing him. She was simply learning how to survive disappointment without letting it show on her face. Shrinking felt safer than longing openly. Tony noticed the quiet difference, but interpreted it wrongly. He told himself she was finally relaxing into the peace of the marriage. He mistook retreat for comfort. One evening, he found her in the library rereading the same page for several minutes. "You seem tired," he said. Elizabeth closed the book gently. "I am fine." The answer was respectful and empty. Tony stood there longer than necessary, sensing a distance he could not name. After he left, Elizabeth pressed the book to her chest and shut her eyes. She missed the version of herself who once looked at him with hope instead of measured gratitude. Tiffany came to visit on a Sunday afternoon, carrying homemade chin-chin and a smile that faded the moment she hugged her sister. "You are thinner," she said immediately. Elizabeth laughed lightly. "Marriage has not starved me, Tiffany. But younger sisters notice what others miss." During tea in the upstairs lounge, Tiffany studied Elizabeth's face and asked quietly, "Are you truly happy?" Elizabeth's fingers paused around her cup. She began the speech she had perfected for outsiders. "Tony is kind. He takes care of everything. He respects me." Tiffany interrupted with painful softness. "I did not ask whether he is a good man. I asked whether you are happy." That night, after Tiffany left, Elizabeth sat alone in the dark and let the truth speak where no one else could hear it. "I don't know if my husband wants me," she whispered. The sentence felt so shameful, she nearly covered her mouth after saying it. Yet, once spoken, more followed. She admitted to herself that Tony's goodness no longer protected her from pain. It deepened it. Cruel husbands are easier to understand. Distant kind ones leave you blaming yourself. Elizabeth cried harder than she had cried in months. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because silent suffering had finally found a name and voice. A heavy storm hit the city one evening, and just after dinner, the electricity went out. The generator failed for the first time in months, leaving the house wrapped in darkness and candlelight. Elizabeth and Tony ended up in the sitting room with a lantern between them, listening to rain beat against the windows. Without the usual distractions, conversation came more honestly. They spoke about fear, childhood loneliness, and the strange lives grief forces people into. Elizabeth confessed she had once imagined marriage as laughter in kitchens and whispered conversations at midnight. Tony listened more deeply than usual, his eyes fixed on the trembling candlelight on her face. The distance between them softened until it almost disappeared. When Elizabeth shivered, Tony removed his jacket and placed it over her shoulders. Their hands brushed. Neither moved away. For one brief, aching moment, everything inside him leaned toward her. Elizabeth lifted her eyes, open and vulnerable, and Tony felt the full force of what he had been denying. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to stop waiting. But then fear returned. What if this softness came from dependence, gratitude, or the storm's loneliness? He stepped back emotionally before moving physically. You should sleep, he said quietly. Elizabeth nodded, hiding the crack inside her heart. The beginning of their second year of marriage did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with emotional exhaustion. Elizabeth no longer counted the nights Tony stayed distant. Counting had become another form of hurting herself. Instead, she moved through her days with disciplined composure. She read more, visited Tiffany more often, and poured herself into small routines that did not depend on her husband's emotional courage. Yet love for Tony had not faded. That was the worst part. She did not feel numb. She felt deeply and had nowhere safe to put those feelings. The marriage had become a beautiful room where her heart had learned to cry quietly. Tony, on his part, felt the weight of every passing day. He noticed Elizabeth's warmth dimming, though he could not fully interpret it. He found himself lingering outside rooms she occupied, just to hear the sound of her turning pages or speaking softly to the staff. Desire had long stopped being abstract. It lived in his body now, sharp and human. But every time he imagined stepping toward her, that same old moral dread returned. He told himself timing mattered. He told himself restraint was noble. Yet, beneath those explanations was a more frightening truth. He had begun needing Elizabeth in ways he no longer controlled. Tanya's jealousy grew with each passing month. Elizabeth's quiet dignity irritated her because it refused to collapse publicly. One afternoon, after arriving without notice, Tanya found Elizabeth arranging flowers in the upstairs hallway. She leaned against the banister and said with mocking sweetness, "You really are devoted to this performance." Elizabeth glanced up. "What performance?" Tanya smiled thinly, pretending, "You are loved." "Tell me, Elizabeth, what kind of man leaves his wife untouched for 2 years unless he married her out of duty, pity, or embarrassment?" The words landed with surgical cruelty because they echoed the darkest fear Elizabeth had never fully confessed, even to herself. Elizabeth put the vase down so carefully. It frightened Tanya more than a slap would have. "Leave my house," Elizabeth said. Her voice was low, trembling with restrained pain. Tanya laughed once, uncertainly. "I only said what everyone thinks." Elizabeth stepped closer, tears burning in her eyes. "Leave." Tanya left, but her words stayed behind, like poison in the air. That evening, Elizabeth stood before the mirror and studied herself with fresh humiliation. Had she mistaken safety for love? Had she wrapped duty in romantic hope because the truth was too painful to survive? She sat on the floor and cried until she could not feel her face. A few weeks later, Elizabeth received an email about an international postgraduate program funded through an educational trust created in memory of her father. Tony had helped structure that trust long ago during the legal cleanup of her father's affairs, but Elizabeth had never seriously imagined using it. Now, as she read the details, something stirred inside her, a fragile possibility that belonged to her alone. The program was prestigious, meaningful, and closely aligned with the dreams her father once had for her. She printed the documents and tucked them into a drawer, then sat still for a long time with her fingers pressed to her lips and tears gathering silently. Living did not feel like rebellion. It felt like breathing from a place she had forgotten still existed inside her. Yet, the thought also broke her heart because she did not want freedom from Tony as much as she wanted a real marriage with him. The fact that she was considering distance revealed how tired her hope had become. When Tiffany visited and saw brochures on the desk, her eyes widened. "Are you thinking of going?" Elizabeth answered softly. "I am thinking of what remains of me if I stay this way much longer." Tiffany held her hand and said nothing, because some griefs have no comforting sentence. Tony began noticing patterns that unsettled him more than outright conflict would have. Elizabeth was still courteous, still elegant, still responsible, but she no longer sought his eyes across rooms. She no longer saved stories from her day to tell him at dinner. When he returned home, she welcomed him properly, then seemed to recede into some private interior place he could not access. He tried drawing closer in small ways. He came home earlier, asked more personal questions, brought her books and flowers, suggested quiet drives on the weekend. Elizabeth accepted everything with grace, but there was a softness missing now, a waiting that had stopped. The realization disturbed Tony deeply. A wife can remain in the same house while her heart quietly begins packing. He understood that instinctively and hated how helpless it made him feel. One evening, he found her asleep in the library chair with an open notebook on her lap. He almost brushed her hair back, but stopped himself at the last second. As always, that habitual withdrawal suddenly felt foolish, not noble. Watching her sleeping face, Tony understood something for the first time, with full force. Patience was not endless. He might wake one day and discover he had protected the marriage straight into emptiness. The discovery came by accident. Tony was looking for a set of house documents in Elizabeth's writing desk because his assistant said she had once stored family papers there temporarily. Instead, he found an envelope filled with admission letters, visa requirements, and travel preparation notes. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. He sat down, reading the papers twice to be sure his mind was not distorting them. Abroad, departure dates, housing options, academic orientation. The thought of Elizabeth leaving did not feel mild or theoretical. It struck him like sudden injury. His carefully managed calm cracked under the sheer violence of what the papers implied. When Elizabeth entered the room and saw the documents in his hand, her face changed instantly. "Tony," she began. He stood too fast. "You were planning to leave?" His voice was sharper than she had ever heard. Elizabeth drew a breath. "I had not decided yet." Hot rose ahead of wisdom in him. "You were going to walk away this easily after everything I have done?" Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief, then laughed once through fresh tears. "Everything you have done?" she repeated. "Tony, we built a beautiful life, yes, but not a real marriage." The quiet truth of that sentence shook the room harder than shouting could. What followed was not a loud, chaotic fight. It was worse. It was years of restrained pain, finally finding language. Elizabeth stood across from Tony, trembling but unflinching. "You care for me like I am something precious," she said, "but never like I am yours." Tony opened his mouth, but she continued, tears falling unchecked now. "Do you know what it does to a woman to lie beside kindness and still feel unwanted? Do you know what it is like to thank a man for comfort while dying for certainty?" Her words struck with devastating clarity because none of them were exaggerated. Each one was earned by long silence. Tony looked shaken in a way Elizabeth had never seen. She pressed a hand over her chest, trying to steady her breath. "Tell me the truth," she whispered. "Did you marry me because you wanted me, or because my father asked you to?" Tony did not answer immediately. He could not. Too many things tangled in that silence duty. Guilt, fear, desire, and the knowledge that his hesitation would wound her no matter what followed. Elizabeth closed her eyes as if bracing for impact. "That pause tells me more than words," she said brokenly. Tony reached toward her, but for the first time, she stepped back. That night, Tony drove alone to the old study in another wing of the house, where he kept archived files, letters, and legal papers connected to Elizabeth's father. The room was lined with wood shelves and smelled faintly of dust and old ink. He sat heavily at the desk and pulled out the file he had avoided emotionally for years. Hospital notes, estate issues, handwritten letters. His late mentor's fragile handwriting stared back at him from the pages. Tony reread everything slowly, forcing himself to return to the beginning, rather than hide inside the version of the story he had repeated to himself. Promise, duty, restraint, moral obligation. But sitting there alone, Tony could no longer lie with comfort. He realized his distance had not come only from noble caution. Something much more frightening had lived beneath it. He had fallen in love with Elizabeth far earlier than he admitted. That love had made touching her feel dangerous because it meant vulnerability, hunger, and need things he associated with losing control. If he kept the marriage inside the language of duty, he could still pretend it was manageable. But love had ruined that neat arrangement. He lowered his head into both hands. "I was afraid," he said aloud to the empty room, and the admission humbled him deeply. The next afternoon, Tony met Raoul in his private office, shut the door himself, and finally told the full truth without edits. He spoke about the hospital promise, Elizabeth's vulnerability, the marriage, the months of waiting, the guilt that had followed every moment of desire, and the way love had turned simple closeness into something frighteningly sacred. Raoul listened in silence, not interrupting even once. When Tony finished, the room was heavy with exhaustion. Raoul sighed and leaned forward. "So all this time, you were not protecting her from lust." you were protecting yourself from love. Tony looked away because hearing it aloud made it impossible to deny. Raoul's voice softened, but not enough to remove the sting. Love is not dishonor when it is honest, Tony. What dishonors a woman is making her live in uncertainty while you polish your conscience. Tony swallowed hard. Raoul continued. You gave her your name, your money, your protection, your house, but you never gave her certainty. A woman can survive hardship. What breaks her is feeling unseen inside safety. Tony sat still, each word carving away his defenses. Then, what do I do now? He asked. Raoul held his gaze. For once in your life, tell the woman the truth before you lose the right to. Elizabeth did not pack her bags physically yet, but emotionally, she began the slow work of loosening her grip. She spent more time with Tiffany, took long walks in the garden, and reread old journals from before marriage when her life still belonged clearly to her. She visited her father's grave and sat there longer than usual, tracing the engraved letters with trembling fingers. I tried, she whispered. I really tried. She was not angry at Tony in the loud, fiery way novels often describe. She was simply tired, tired of hoping, tired of interpreting silence, tired of being grateful for a life that quietly broke her heart. Still, love refused to die neatly. That was the cruelty of it. She could not imagine hating Tony even now. She remembered all the gentle things. How he shielded Tiffany. How he never dishonored her family. How he noticed her favorite tea without asking twice. Those memories did not lessen her pain. They sharpened it. If he had been cruel, living would have been easier. Instead, she faced the more complicated sorrow of loving a good man who had never made her feel chosen. One evening, Tiffany held her while she cried, and Elizabeth whispered, I am not grieving divorce. I am grieving the marriage I kept waiting for. Tony came to Elizabeth without his usual armor. No controlled expression, no careful distance, no polished explanations. He found her in the morning room near the window, light falling across her face in soft gold. For a second, he just looked at her, as though memorizing what he had almost lost by hiding behind restraint. Elizabeth, he said, and even his voice sounded different, less guarded, more human. She turned slowly. Tony took a breath. I kept my distance because you entered this marriage in grief, instability, and vulnerability. I was terrified that if I reached for you too soon, I would be taking what circumstance placed in my hands. He paused, struggling for composure, then continued. But that is not the whole truth. Elizabeth's eyes searched his face. Tony swallowed. Somewhere along the way, I fell deeply in love with you, and that made everything worse. Because touching you stopped feeling simple. It began to feel sacred, selfish, and dangerous all at once. I told myself I was being honorable, but I was also afraid of how much you had come to matter to me. Elizabeth stood motionless, stunned by the honesty that had come 2 years too late, and yet still hit her heart with painful force. When Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice trembled with pain rather than anger. If you had told me that before, I would have understood. Tony closed his eyes briefly. She shook her head. Your silence did not feel noble from where I stood, Tony. It felt like rejection. It felt like I was standing outside the door of my own marriage, waiting to be let in. Tears spilled freely now, but she did not look away from him. You left me alone with my questions every night. I wondered if I was unattractive, inadequate, inconvenient, or simply a promise you could not break. Do you know what that did to me? Tony's face crumpled with visible regret. Elizabeth pressed a hand to her throat, gathering the strength to say what she had guarded longest. I kept believing that the day you finally reached for me as your wife would be the day I truly knew I belonged to you. The sentence shattered him. He took an unsteady step closer, eyes wet now, his voice breaking when he said her name. In that moment, Tony saw with terrible clarity the cost of his restraint. It had not protected her innocence. It had bruised her identity. And the woman he loved had carried that bruising alone out of loyalty. What changed that night was not sudden passion after prolonged denial. It was truth finally making room for tenderness. Tony did not approach Elizabeth like a man claiming a right. He approached like a husband asking for grace after causing pain he never meant to cause. Do not give me anything out of pity for my regrets, he said softly. I want only what your heart truly chooses. Elizabeth stood still for a long moment, reading the humility in his face. Then she stepped toward him, placed her hand against his chest, and whispered, "I have been choosing you all along. I only needed to know you were choosing me too." Their closeness unfolded with reverence, gentleness, apology, tears, and relief. Tony handled her as though she were something infinitely precious, not fragile, but deeply cherished. And when he realized, with stunned tenderness, that Elizabeth was still a virgin, he froze in emotional disbelief. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice breaking. She lowered her eyes and said softly, "I kept waiting for my husband." That simple confession undid him completely. His love tripled in one aching wave, not because of innocence alone, but because she had preserved her heart, her trust, and her hope inside a marriage that had given her every reason to surrender those things. The morning after did not erase the past, but it softened it. Sunlight spilled through the curtains, warming the room that had held so many silent nights before this one. Tony woke before Elizabeth and simply watched her sleep, unable to hide the awe and grief mingling in him. He traced nothing without permission, touched nothing carelessly, but when she opened her eyes, he was there with a look she had waited 2 years to receive, open, certain, and unguarded. "Good morning, my wife," he said quietly. Elizabeth nearly cried at the ordinary beauty of those words. For the first time, they sounded complete. Tony changed in visible ways after that. He lingered over breakfast instead of rushing to work. He called during the day just to ask how she was feeling. He held her hand for no reason. He apologized not once, but repeatedly, not in performative guilt, but in genuine recognition of what his silence had cost. Elizabeth was happy, yes, but still tender in places love had bruised. Tony understood that and did not hurry her healing. Some wounds vanish through affection, others require time and consistency. Their marriage did not become perfect overnight. It became honest, warm, and alive, and that was far more precious. A few weeks later, while sorting through older files with fresh emotional clarity, Tony found a letter from Elizabeth's father that he had somehow never read carefully enough before. He sat down immediately, pulse quickening as he moved through the elegant handwriting. The words were full of trust and gratitude, but what struck him most was what they did not say. Her father had asked him to protect Elizabeth's future, dignity, opportunities, and safety. He had not instructed Tony to marry her. The marriage itself had been Tony's own conclusion, his own decision made in the storm of that painful season. Tony stared at the page, shaking to his core. The revelation undid years of hidden self-deception. He could no longer comfort himself with the idea that he had simply obeyed a dying man's request. No, he had chosen Elizabeth. Even before he admitted love, something in him had refused to leave her exposed to a cruel world. That meant the marriage had not been borrowed duty from the start. It had been his instinctive claiming of her place in his life long before he had the courage to name that instinct for what it was. Tony sat there with tears in his eyes, humbled by how deeply his own heart had known the truth before his mind allowed it. Tony told Elizabeth that evening. They were sitting on the veranda where dusk often made the world feel softer and more honest. He handed her the letter and watched her read. She grew quiet, her fingers trembling slightly around the paper. When she finished, she looked up at him with tears gathering. "So my father did not ask you to marry me?" Tony shook his head slowly. "He asked me to protect you. The marriage was my choice." Elizabeth searched his face. Tony's voice dropped. "I think I chose you long before I was brave enough to admit it. I just kept hiding behind duty because it was easier than confessing love." Elizabeth cried then, but these were not the same tears that had fueled their marriage before. These were tears of release, of being finally and fully understood. She moved into his arms, and Tony held her with the certainty of a man no longer hiding from himself. "You were never a debt I paid," he whispered against her hair. "You were the woman my heart recognized before my mind could explain it." Elizabeth smiled through tears. The story ended not in grand public drama, but in private victory. She was no longer a protected obligation in a beautiful cage. She was chosen, loved, and finally home. We've come to the end of the story. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like, share, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification. Thank you so much for watching.